Okay. Whew. Breathe in, breathe out. Hey everyone, welcome to The Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we have a very special guest, Dr. Graham Oppy. Thank you so much for coming on with me.
It's a pleasure.
So today we are going to discuss the nature, purpose, and conditions for success of arguments. We're basically going to be targeting what makes for a good argument. What are arguments good for? And so Graham Oppy's been working a lot on ontological arguments, arguments from evil, basically all sorts of arguments for and against God's existence and in different areas of philosophy. So I guess we should start by defining what an argument is. So if you want to take the floor with defining that.
Okay, so I'm going to define the word argument and then explain that it's a sort of technical use. It's what we mean by argument in philosophy, in particular in philosophy of religion, when we're talking about arguments about the existence of God. So an argument is just a list of sentences, or a set of, better still, a set of sentences, one of which is the conclusion and the rest of which are the premises. Now, you might think that it would be better to make this definition not in terms of sentences, but in terms of something like what sentences express, so that it's propositions. I don't think that it's going to matter. That it's often enough in philosophy we don't fuss too much about the distinction between sentences and propositions. We worry about it only when it matters, and it's not going to matter for the purposes of this discussion. Okay, so that was the first thing. What's an argument? There's a second thing that it's also important to define and distinguish from arguments, and that's the notion of a derivation. So you can think of a derivation as like a proof, or like a mathematical proof. So a derivation is an ordered list. It's not just a set. It's an ordered list where you number each of the lines, and you start off with your premises of your argument, and you end up with your conclusion, and in between there's a bunch of lines, each of which you get from what came earlier, and there's a little justification, what's often called an annotation, so that someone who's trying to follow the derivation can work out how you got that line, what justifies its being there in the derivation, and if the derivation's good, eventually you'll get to the conclusion. Well, actually, maybe whether or not it's good, but but in a good derivation, you'll get to the conclusion. The annotation for premises is just going to be premise, and then the annotation for everything else, almost everything else, will be there's some rule of logic in whatever the logical system is that you're working in. So, for example, if you've got a line in your derivation that says that has the form if A then B, and another line that has the form A, then you can add to your derivation at a lower line B, and then you refer to the numbers of the earlier lines and say by modus ponens. Right? And so that's the idea of a derivation. For a given argument, there will be many different derivations, right? If you've got a valid argument, an argument where the conclusion does follow logically from the premises, there'll be lots and lots of different arguments, lots and lots of ways of deriving the conclusion from the premises. That brings me to the third thing that I wanted to quickly say something about, which is identity conditions for the things that I've mentioned. So arguments are distinguished by their premises and conclusions. If you've got a different premise, you've got a different argument. If you've got a different conclusion, you've got a different argument. People sometimes talk about things like the cosmological argument or the ontological argument. What they really have in mind, sort of interpreting them charitably, is that there's a family of arguments that have certain kinds of similarities, and they're talking about one of the arguments from that family. Derivations, sorry, the identity for the sentences, so premises and conclusion, basically goes by wording. You change the wording in any way and you've got a new premise. Maybe that's not exactly right, or a new conclusion. Maybe that's not exactly right, but it's pretty common for people to think that validity is a matter of form And changing a word will typically change the form of a sentence. And so while we could maybe have a kind of slightly less strict way of identifying the premises and conclusions, basically we should think, if you change the wording, we now have to go back and reconsider whether we've got the same argument or not. I mean, changing one word in the argument can easily change it from being valid to invalid, or vice versa. For derivations, I won't fuss about the identity conditions. They're extremely difficult to come up with, but the thing that I said before will probably be true, that for a given argument, a given valid argument, there'll be lots of good derivations, because you can change up the order of things. Maybe even you can use different rules and still get to the end result. So that's almost it by way of just setting the background. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, which is that this was technical definition. This is using the word argument the way that it's used in the philosophy classroom. There's a very different way of using the word argument in ordinary language, where I think that an argument is just any kind of, I'll say, war of words that we have, where there's a difference in our attitudes and we're trying to negotiate it. So maybe our beliefs disagree or our plans disagree or something like that, and we're trying to sort out what to do. And so we have an argument, right? The argument might be heated or it might not. It's not that argument means we get angry. It just means that we're trying to negotiate disagreement. So there's an example which I'll give you, which I think illustrates the notion of this sort of ordinary notion of argument and indicates how it's different from arguments in the technical sense. And when we go on later in our discussion, it'll be arguments in the technical sense that we're kind of puzzled about. So consider this: we're planning to catch a train at 11:15, right? And you say to me, we better leave now. We've got to leave or we'll miss the train. And I say, no, relax, we got lots of time. And you say, it's 10:30, right? If we don't go now, we will miss the train. And I say, no, come on, it's only 10:15. Right? We got lots of time. And then you say, and I say, you know, your watch must be wrong. And then you say, I don't think it's my watch. I think your watch has stopped. Okay, so now we've got to, so then you say, look at your phone. So I pull out my phone. It's 10:30. Oops, we better go. Well, what are we waiting for? And off we go. And now we've resolved, right, in the course of this exchange, we've resolved a disagreement in a successful kind of way. We've had what colloquially passes for an argument. But at no point did we transact sets of premises and conclusions, right, in the course of doing that. And it would be weird to reconstruct what we did as us passing backwards and forwards sets of premises and conclusions. Now, I actually think that what I just gave you, that little story, is a kind of, would actually be quite a good model for philosophical argument as well, but that's a different story. We won't get into that. Okay, but that's just to say, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the use of arguments in the technical sense, sets of premises and conclusion.
Okay, yeah, I do think it's definitely helpful to get clear on the different technical notions and you know, the conception that we're going to be using throughout this discussion. So I was curious about what got you personally interested in arguments, if there's any biographical history to that.
So yes, I don't know how interesting it is. From the time that I became an atheist, so I don't know, I was 13 or 14, I loved arguing in the non-technical sense, right, in the everyday sense with people about religion and God. And I gradually started to read stuff by philosophers. So I can remember a teacher gave me Pascal's Wager to look at, and read Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian, which had some arguments in it and so on. When I got to university and I started doing philosophy, in my first semester, the very first essay that I wrote was on the Meditation 5 in Descartes, right? So I have been interested in these arguments for a very long time. And I worked, as you said in the introduction, I kept working on it. I worked on lots of different kinds of arguments. And over time, I became increasingly dissatisfied with the state of of discussion in philosophy of religion of the arguments. And one way of maybe pointing to the dissatisfaction is this. We think that it's not right to say, oh, look, I believe in God, you don't, so I win. Right? We think that's not a good move. Now, suppose we've got an argument and there's just one premise in it that we disagree about, and the conclusion is that God exists. If you're going to say, I've got this argument, I win, you might as well have pointed to the single premise and said, we disagree about that, so I win. Well, if you're going to do that, why didn't you just stick with, I believe in God, so I win? Or if you're an atheist, I don't believe in God, so I win. Right? There's something very puzzling about what people are thinking the standard for success is for a philosophical argument. And over time, that came to just worry me more and more and more.
I could definitely see, because that's really been on my mind recently. That's why I reached out to you. And I had that question. I know we're not going to get to it now, but I had that question on like Morian shifts, and this has been actually kind of puzzling me for quite a while. So I definitely get that sort of persistent nagging. But before going into the sort of criteria for successive arguments, maybe we should just ask, well, why is it important, right? Why should we care about this? Why don't we just actually get into philosophical argumentation? Why should we care?
Right. So, I know part of it is kind of illustrated by the worry that I was just mentioning. If we don't really have a good idea about what success for arguments is, then I think we'll end up with these very kind of fruitless disputes about whether particular arguments are successful or not, with no satisfactory way of resolving them. So it's pretty clear that we can kind of share information and that we kind of understand which propositions, which sentences we agree about and which ones we disagree about. And from that, it's pretty clear that we can also share information and we kind of understand and can agree about which arguments we think are sound and which arguments we think are not sound. But beyond that, once we're thinking about, okay, so what does make for a successful argument, we seem to be floundering quite a bit. And it would really help if we understood much better what you can actually do with arguments. Right? So that's why we should care about this. I think we just end up wasting our time unless we've started out with some clear conception about what arguments are good for, and then we can show that the arguments that we want to claim are successful actually do meet whatever that goal or standard is.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you also take that approach in your cosmological arguments paper. You first laid out what an argument is, and your conditions for success, and then you went into talking about the different types of cosmological arguments. And the same with your book on arguing about gods. The first chapter was all about arguments and conditions for success. So I think that's also reflected in some of your work as well, which is good. And that you don't normally see that in other philosophy of religion papers and other philosophy of religion books and stuff. Usually they just dig right in. So let's see. So the next thing that I sort of wanted to get to was the questions concerning good or convincing arguments. So especially with respect to your discussion with Edward Feser, one of your main contentions in that discussion was that beliefs and theories are almost entirely prior to arguments. And then you went on to argue how that helps us see that there's very little role for argument in this technical sense in exploring disagreement, especially within philosophy. So I'm wondering if you could characterize what you mean by entirely prior to arguments, that beliefs and theories, and if you could spell out your view here a little bit further.
Okay, so I shall start by saying something else and then get to that. So I do think that there's a very clear and important role for arguments in the technical sense in philosophy. So, and if in philosophical exchanges. So one of the things that's true of everybody is that their beliefs have lots of commitments that they haven't yet noticed, right? So anything that's entailed by your beliefs is something that you're committed to, right? Belief's not closed under implication. It's not that you believe these things. It's that you're committed to them by your beliefs. And one thing that you can do with an argument, and for now, we're just going to focus on logical arguments, arguments where the consequence is logical consequence. We might later come back and wonder if there are other kinds of arguments, but let's just focus on logical consequence. If something's a logical consequence of things I believe, then I'm committed to it. And if I can't see it and you give me an argument that says, look, you believe these things, derive, conclusion, that might be really a useful thing to do, right? In particular, it will be useful if the conclusion is absurd, right? If my beliefs have absurd consequences, then that's not a good position for me to be in, right? I've got some work to do to revise my beliefs. Right? I mean, I might not be able to do it straight away. It might take me years to figure out how to manage this. And in the kind of classical case, often it'll be contradiction or be absurdity, but I want to leave it open whether it's classical logic or relevance logic or something like that. But in whatever, once your beliefs are shown to logically entail absurdity, something, right? Okay, so it's also the case that even if it's not absurdity that's entailed, it's just some claim, I may still have work to do, because once it's brought to my attention, I might think, but that's not right. I don't believe that. It's not that it's absurd, it's just wrong, false. And then I'm still going to have some work to do. I'm still going to have to go back and revise the beliefs that I previously had in order to remove the entailment. Or alternatively, I might think, okay, yeah, that's fine. And then it just becomes another one of the things that I explicitly or implicitly believe, rather than something that was a kind of unnoticed consequence. Right, so it's not my view that arguments have no use or that they can't do useful work. I think that that's really important work that arguments can do. What's controversial in my view is that that's what I think they do. That's the only useful thing that they do. And I don't want to kind of be misrepresented as saying that arguments do no useful work, because that's not what I think. Okay, suppose, all right, and maybe I mean, probably this doesn't need illustrating, but in the history of philosophy, there are lots of examples of successful arguments of this kind. So, for example, Bertrand Russell wrote a letter to Frege saying, dude, right, your axioms for the foundations of arithmetic, they're inconsistent. Right? And that was really important. Frege tried to patch his book. His manuscript was ready to go to the press. He had amended one of the axioms and sent it off. The patch wasn't entirely successful, but the point was that Russell's argument was a very good one, right? Or to take a different example with the boot slightly on the other foot, Gödel showed that there was something seriously wrong with the foundations of Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, with a famous paper that he published in about 1930. And again, it was the kind of derivation of a contradiction from a set of claims that Russell and Whitehead had committed themselves to. And you can find, I mean, those two examples have the kind of special feature that they're in a technical area, logic or mathematics, but you may be able to find similar examples in less technical areas as well. Okay, so that was what you can do with arguments, and it relied on the idea that there are these unnoticed consequences of things. So let's try and think about what happens if that's not the case. Right, suppose there are no unnoticed consequences. Imagine that you've got people whose beliefs are closed under logical consequence. And let's suppose that we give them kind of unlimited logical competence, so they can tell that their beliefs are consistent. Right? So then what work is there left that arguments can do? Right? If you imagine people who've got who are in this position that there's no unnoticed consequences to be pointed out, and they're logically competent, so they can tell, that there's no logical inconsistency in the beliefs that they've got, then I struggle to think of anything that one of them could do for another by giving them an argument, right? And so this is, at the moment, this is just a kind of intuition pump, right? It's kind of challenging to think what else arguments could be good for other than the pointing out unnoticed consequences. One thing that, and now we get to your original question, right? If you think about these people and you think about their judgments about what's true, so they're committed to theories, and their theories are consistent and they know what all the consequences are, and then you think about their judgments about the soundness of arguments, which arguments are such that the premises are all true and the conclusion follows from the premises. Their judgments about which arguments are sound are fully determined by their judgments about which premises are true, right? All the information you need in order to work out which are the sound arguments by their lights is which are the true premises. So that's the sense in which truth of theories is prior to soundness of arguments. Right? It's at a more fundamental level, and there's this kind of determination relation. Now, it's true that when I've given the argument, it's about a special case. It's not exactly about us. But still, the point is, if you think about a theory, right, just as something that's closed under logical consequence, given the theory, you've got a determination of a set of sound arguments. So I hope that's clear enough.
I do think so. It's sort of like an idealization, and I know in different debates of yours you say you take the best theist and then the best natural. It's almost like the sort of ideal situation, the intuition pump that you've been giving. We take the best account of each sort of theory and then we compare those, rather than a sort of imperfectly rational creature or person on either side. So I actually do think that this bridges nicely into the fourth question that I had on there, which is, doesn't it still seem in your intuition pump case that we could perhaps have one of the people, there's a justification for a belief or maybe an intuition that they have for something that they haven't yet been presented with, and then once they realize that and they realize the sort of full intuitive force behind it, then they come to change their theory. I'm not quite sure how I can articulate this, so I think I'm going to use an example. So let's say we have a physicalist and a non-physicalist, and we want to, let's say we're exploring Mary's room argument or something. A lot of physicalists, even though they might have a fully worked out theory, they might come to be presented with this sort of strong intuition pump of Mary's room, and they ask themselves, like, did she learn something new when she came to see red? And a lot of them are like, they come to see this new justification or this new deeply held intuition that's sort of shared across paradigms or shared across theories, and then as a result of that intuition, they sort of change their theory. Not always, of course. I mean, this is just an example. Like, we don't have to get caught up in Mary's room. But I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit. I'm not sure how to sort of precisely articulate this, but hopefully I'm getting the main point across. Okay, so
if you think about the state that people are typically in, there'll be some, I'm just going to talk in intuitive way about belief. There'll be propositions that they believe, there'll be propositions that they've suspended judgment about, and there'll be propositions that they haven't considered yet. Right. So if you think of propositions as coming in pairs, so a proposition and its negation, and we just keep on assuming consistency in the background, then with respect to a given proposition, either you think it's true, you think it's false, you've considered it, you've weighed it up, but you haven't come down one side or the other, or you just have no opinion about it because you haven't considered it yet. Now, even in the case of the black and white Mary, that thought experiment, I think that what's going on, if it's really changing people's views, is that you have people who are kind of innocents. They haven't considered this particular proposition before, and now they consider it, and when they consider it, they think, looking at it, weighing it up, they think, yeah, that looks like it's right. And then, because there's now an inconsistency in their beliefs, they revise the rest of their beliefs accordingly. That, in that case, what's doing the work is not an argument. It's becoming acquainted with a proposition that you haven't thought about previously and thinking about how to integrate it. Now, it's got to be part of your view that there's new propositions coming in all the time. Lots of them are evidence, right? New evidence, and we keep updating our beliefs accordingly. But it doesn't seem to me that this has got anything to do with argument. That's not how it comes in, and it's not how the processing, the updating works. Right. Now, you might say, but couldn't there be a kind of, I don't know, might it not be beneficial to get the new evidence or the new proposition coming in the form of an argument, so that it's one of the premises and you've got this other stuff? At the very least, that's kind of superfluous, right? Because the thing that's going to be doing the work is there's this new proposition and I'm thinking about what to say about it. And once I've done that, the question about whether there's some argument that applies to me will depend upon whether, I've just accepted the proposition and not realized that my beliefs are now inconsistent. But that's not the kind of thing that's likely to happen. Right. Now, I don't know, maybe I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, so what if someone pushed back like this? They say, okay, well, a number of physicalists, perhaps they did consider this proposition like deeply. They just hadn't considered it in this light before, or they came to consider it in a new light, which sort of provided them with the intuitions that, oh yeah, she probably did learn something new, even though I'd considered this proposition before and I had reasons for rejecting it. I just can't give up on this intuition. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
So then it sounds like there's an inconsistency, and it fits and now sounds like you're fitting it back into the case that I don't dispute is a real case, okay. Right? If my beliefs are inconsistent and I can't see it, then giving me an argument is very helpful, right? But we were supposed to be looking for something that wasn't an instance of that.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. So if we could probably go on to talking about what's that. We've been talking about arguments, and we're talking about defining arguments and how beliefs and theories are prior to arguments. And now we've also talked about the role of theory change and how people like physicalists might change to non-physicalists and how that fits in with the conception. So that's a layout of what we've been so far. So perhaps it'll be good now to move on to what a sort of extra ingredient, what I called in what I sent you, an extra ingredient, yeah, to what turns a sound argument into a good or convincing argument. So for the audience, some people I know actually haven't considered this, because it's actually kind of interesting to think about. We know that mere validity in different critical thinking texts usually say an argument is sound. That means it's a good argument. They don't get into the nuance that no, that's not the case. So we know that validity in true premises, for the audience, that is to say soundness, that's not sufficient for a good argument, right? So exactly one of the following is sound, right? If 1 equals 1, then God exists. 1 equals 1, therefore God exists. That's on the one side. And then if 1 equals 1, then God doesn't exist. 1 equals 1, so God doesn't exist. Exactly one of those is sound, right? But neither of them are going to be convincing or good arguments. And so we need some sort of extra ingredient, soundness plus question mark, as I put it. We need some sort of extra ingredient for an argument to be good or convincing. And so I was wondering if you could perhaps give your account first, maybe, and talk about what you think the extra ingredient is. And then we can start getting into like alternative conceptions, the different ones that I laid down. So I can pull it over to you.
Okay, so I think that the right account of what makes for a good argument is relative to audience. So arguments are good for particular people at particular times in particular circumstances, and there isn't any non-relative account of what's a good argument. And I've already said what I think makes for a good argument, right? So for this particular audience, a good argument is going to be one that starts from their premises and leads to a conclusion that they don't yet believe, either absurdity or some other proposition. And the reason why it's a good argument is because it gives them some real cognitive work to do, right? They've now discovered something about themselves that they hadn't recognized previously, that their beliefs are inconsistent, or that they're committed to this claim that they're inclined to accept that would nonetheless be in tension with other things. Sorry, that they're inclined to reject. Maybe I should put it that way, or whatever. So that some revision needs to go on. So that's what I think good audience, what makes for a good argument. That means that I'm not thinking that it's soundness plus something else. And one of the problems with the soundness plus something else account is that it's obvious that one of the very best forms of argument is reductio. I take a bunch of claims and I show that they entail absurdity. But no reductio is sound. A reductio can't have all true premises, right? So it always seemed to me that, and I agree with you, that this textbook account is one you find in logic texts and informal logic texts all over the place, is just obviously no good. And you shouldn't be looking for a soundness plus account, because you've immediately excluded the paradigm. For me, what's the paradigm of a good argument, namely a good reductio.
Okay, yeah, that's I actually hadn't thought of. I mean, I guess someone could respond by saying like, oh, well, you could always put reductios in terms of, I guess you could say modus tollens, right? I mean, like, if you accept these things, then it's a contradiction, but there can't be contradictions, so you have to get rid of one of these. So that's how someone might respond, but...
Sure, and that's fine. But then it's worth thinking about this, maybe this is a good point to bring up, this fact about classical logic, right, is that there's a link between validity and inconsistency. So an argument with premises P and conclusions C is valid just in case the set of sentences P together with not C is inconsistent, where inconsistent means it entails an absurdity. So there's a very close link between reductio and validity of the kind that you've just mentioned. So there is that point, but the important thing to remember is that when you present it in the reductio form, it just says there's an inconsistency here. You can't believe all these things. Presenting it in the other form obscures the fact that actually you have a choice, right? When I tell you that the argument's valid, I'm saying if you believe all these things, you better believe this one too. I'm not, but there's nothing in that that says believe all these things and this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good response to that. So it seems as though there is a difficulty with a soundness plus question mark account, especially with regard to the paradigm of arguments. So I still want to see if we can explore the two different, not the mind-changing view, because you already sort of covered that number 7. You already sort of covered that because that has to do with the reductio, and if you find that your beliefs entail a conclusion which is absurd, well, then you have some work to do. So that was sort of your account. We can scratch off 7. But I do want to see if we can explore the neutral agnostic view. So for the audience, the neutral agnostic view says that, okay, a good argument or a convincing argument is soundness plus the following condition concerning like neutral agnostics. So a convincing argument is one that should or ought to convince a neutral agnostic on the topic in question. So for instance, a neutral agnostic would come into the Mary's room thing. They aren't physicalists, they aren't a non-physicalist, they'd come to the argument, and a convincing argument is one that should or ought to convince that person to become a non-physicalist for this Mary's room case. So I'm wondering if you could speak about maybe perhaps deficiencies in this, or yeah.
Okay, so I'll start with, it's quite useful. The way that this is set up, we're thinking about an agnostic. It's useful to distinguish here, as in other contexts, between agnostics and innocents. So an agnostic, the way I see it, is somebody who's considered this proposition and finds a balance between the considerations for and against. We could idealize and suppose that it's a kind of exact balance. Maybe it doesn't, maybe you count as an agnostic if you tilt slightly one way or the other, or maybe you don't, right? I mean, there's kind of fuzziness here, but anyway. An innocent is in a very different situation. They just haven't considered the proposition. So they've got no views. Maybe you might think that in some cases, they're going to have dispositions to form beliefs that go one way or another, and maybe we can come back and worry about that. But for now, I'm just going to think about the important thing about the innocence is that they haven't considered it. They don't have any opinions yet about it. Now, the other thing to think about is going to be, so what are our obligations in respect of believing? Right? You might say we ought to believe the truth, right? But that can't be a principle that regulates what we do, because I can't independently check the truth to see whether I'm confirming my beliefs to it. And similarly, I ought to believe reliable informants. Well, that can't quite be right either, because I can't independently check who else has got the true beliefs, right? So when we're thinking about what our obligations are here, what I think is that our obligations we have to be thinking about this in a kind of internalist way. I mean, some people want to say that we could just, in effect, our obligations are to believe the truth, and then we can work out which the good arguments are because they're the ones with the true premises, right? I just don't think we can go that way, right? So let's put that to one side. Now, imagine that we've got 3 people. So we're interested in the proposition that P, we've got a believer, we've got who believes that P, we've got a I'll call them a non-believer. They believe that not P, and we've got an agnostic. We've got somebody who's considered the matter, weighed it up, and is sitting in the middle. Okay. Well, suppose that there's a bunch of things that these people all agree about, right? So there's a bunch of propositions, I'll call them P. And then there's a bunch of propositions, I'll call them Q, where their disagreement manifests. So for any proposition in this set, one of the believer and the non-believer thinks it's true, the other one thinks it's false, and the agnostic suspends judgment. So we've got 3 consistent people here, right? Now, suppose that we had an argument that ought to persuade one of the believer and the non-believer. Sorry, we have an argument that ought to persuade the agnostic to change their position. Surely that's going to be an argument that ought to persuade whichever one of the believer or the non-believer isn't in the right position to shift their position too. I don't understand this idea that somehow or other it makes a difference, right? That focusing on the agnostic is going to give you a different result. Okay, so that was a bit quick, and I could spell this out at greater length, maybe if I could read it, because it's a little bit complicated, but that's the basic idea.
Yeah, that is something, because I was in an email I was emailing Josh Rasmussen, and this is a while back, and he was talking about, I mean, somehow it came up that there was an argument in question, and we were talking about how it could sway an agnostic to accept the position. And I was actually, this is in my personal notes for this specific question. I was saying, like, how I remember responding to him, I was saying, like, well, shouldn't the agnostic consider what the best detractor of the view would say? And shouldn't that in and of itself be a reason to continue remaining agnostic if the best detractor has sufficiently good responses, right? You have to, when you're an agnostic, you have to see, you don't just like take the argument itself and then go onto a side. You have to look at what the other side would say in response, and if that's sufficiently, if it shouldn't convince them, well, then it shouldn't convince you, right? Like, you should just stay agnostic on it, because both sides, these guys have their own sufficiently good response to it, right? So I think that's roughly where you're getting at.
Yeah, right. So I'm in some ways probably that says it better than the way that I said it, but yeah, that's exactly right. So I've never been impressed by the idea that that somehow the agnostic has a privileged position in disputes. They're just one of the players, and the same rules apply to them as to everybody else.
Okay, so we've covered the neutral agnostic view. We covered the one that you talked about concerning changing your mind about one of the premises when there's an absurd conclusion or something along those lines. And so there's one other one that I'd like to discuss, and it's the majority view. So this is also along the same lines of soundness plus question mark. And so that question mark, this majority view proponent is going to say is that, well, a convincing argument is one that should or ought to convince just the majority of reasonable people who seriously reflect on it. And, you know, I've actually heard different people like saying, like, oh, well, listen, I mean, most people accept this, and so you should probably, not necessarily an appeal to, you know, ad populum, but talking about conditions for successive arguments. So I'm wondering if you could talk about maybe deficiencies in this, or what you think about this.
Okay, so I mean, I guess the first thing is I don't see why numbers matter, why numbers should matter for the goodness of argument. But I mean, suppose that what you're thinking is that the successful argument is the one that brings about lots of belief revision, right? It has an effect on lots and lots of people. What I'd be inclined to conclude is that just means that there were lots of people who were bad at believing, right? Because their positions were inconsistent or whatever, and they didn't realize it, and now you've pointed it out to them, right? So I don't think that you want to measure the success of arguments in that way, right? Because what you're measuring isn't so much something about the goodness of the argument, but something about the badness of the believing of the people in question. So maybe that will do by way of an answer to that one.
Yeah, I also think that this view might not be able to account for the intuition bump that you were giving at the beginning, right? So arguably, I mean, we just need to consider the ideal versions of each theory, right? And when you're talking about the majority view, we're just not considering the ideal, the best version of theism, the best version of naturalism. That's just not what we're considering when we're talking about the majority view. But that's precisely what we should be considering when we're talking about arguments and the conditions of success, especially if you want to get someone to go from the best version of naturalism to the best version of theism.
So maybe I can add something else here. So suppose that I'm not a philosopher, but I do know some things about the state of philosophy. So I know that there are these people who I don't really understand them when they talk, but I know what they're saying. And there are these people who believe that there are these theists who believe that God exists, and they've got all kinds of reasons for believing that God exists. And there are these naturalists who believe that there are no gods. And now somebody gives me an argument, right, a set of premises and a conclusion, and it makes my head spin. And I can't see that there's anything wrong with this argument. I don't even really know what's going on with it. Should it convince me, right? Or should I rather reflect that the people who know what's going on are divided about this argument? So somehow or other, changing my view on the basis of this particular argument would actually be some kind of mistake. Right. Now, I don't know. I mean, this is just a kind of, at the moment, it's just a kind of thought experiment, right? I'm not recommending it, but maybe there's something to that. Right.
Okay. So, yeah, we've covered the neutral agnostic view, the majority view, and the sort of one that's similar to your view, the mind-changing view. So we already covered that. And so perhaps, I mean, I know you said you might not get to this other one, but are there any other conceptions that you want to discuss or critique, or should we move on?
So, I mean, I guess there are other views that people have had that depend on further assumptions, but it's not clear how to fit them into the way that the discussion has developed. It looks like they're kind of excluded already. So I'm happy to just let things go at this point.
Okay. Okay. So now we can go into the sort of related questions section. And this is one that I actually really wanted to touch on. I know you said it might be difficult to go over, but it's the Moore and Schiff one. So to those of you who don't know, Moore and Schiff, it refers to G.E. Moore. He's a philosopher in the 20th century. And what he did was he was confronted with arguments for skepticism about, for instance, the external world. And the skeptic would give a list of premises, and the conclusion would be, you cannot know, or you do not know that there is an external world. So G.E. Moore came along, and he's like, well, hold on a second. Like, here's a hand, here's another hand. Like, I know that I have hands. Okay, I'll just start with that. I know that I have hands. And then he says, well, if I know that I have hands, then I know, since hands are things in the external world, well, then I know there's an external world. And hence, at least one of your premises, Mr. Skeptic, is wrong. So that's basically what he's saying. And philosophers have come to realize that this is really just taking the form of the skeptic is giving a modus ponens argument in the form of, if you accept the conjunction of the premises, well then, right, the conjunction of the premises entails this for the proposition P, and then you affirm the conjunction of the premises, and so therefore P, right? So that's just modus ponens. But then G.E. Moore comes along and says, well, hold on, I can just do a modus tollens version, right? I can just say, well, hold on a second, not P, right? That's what I'm going to start with. I'm going to start with not P, and I can accept your premise that that conjunction entails P, right? But then by modus tollens, not by modus ponens, we're going to do modus tollens, and we're going to get the falsity of the whole conjunction, which is just negation of disjuncts, right? So you can accept the falsity of this one, or you can deny this one, or you could deny this one, right? So at least one of them is false. Now, what's really bothered me, to those of you who are watching this, what's really bothered me about the Moore and Schiff, and this isn't really an objection to the Moore and Schiff, it's just something that's sort of like been nagging in my intellectual life, as it were, and I haven't really known where to search to like find out what I should think about this. But it seems to me that isn't it always open to one's dialectical opponent, who we can suppose has independent justification for denying the conclusion of any given argument? Can't your dialectical opponent simply run the modus tollens version, thereby concluding that at least one premise is false, right? So for any given argument that you're presented, if you have independent reason for denying the conclusion, right, then you can just treat that argument as modus ponens. The conjunction of the premises entails a conclusion, but you're just going to say, well, no, I have independent reasons for rejecting that conclusion, so at least one of the premises is false. And so I'm wondering, first of all, how this Moore and Schiff thing fits in with your conception of arguments, and second of all, if you could just enlighten me about these difficulties.
Okay, so it really depends what your prior commitments are, because if someone's given you an argument and you accept all the premises and you don't accept the conclusion, and you accept that the argument's valid, then you've got some work to do, because you're committed to a bunch of things that entail something that you're not committed to. I mean, in the worst case, it'll be a Reductio argument, and then it's out of the question. You can't just say, absurdity, I embrace thee, right? You can't do that. So, but even if it's not absurdity, even if it's just some claim, right, that as soon as you see it, you think, I want to reject that, then you've got much more work to do. You can't just say, I'm going to run the argument backwards. It must be that one of these disjuncts is false. I'm going to have to make a decision, right? Because because I'm actually presently committed to all of the disjuncts. So the Moore shift's not as powerful as you were making it out to be, I think. But the Moore shift, I mean, if we imagine, so go back to my other, I mean, this is related to the kind of think about the best case, right? Suppose that we've got a consistent theist and a consistent naturalist, and they've got the kind of best views that they can have. Then it's going to turn out that when you come up with an argument, it's not going to, and we're supposing there's no hidden, commitments on either side, then for any argument that one side thinks is sound, the other side is just going to reject at least one of the premises. And maybe I can shift the discussion a little bit. We can come back to the where it started if you want. What really matters once you start thinking about things in terms of the kind of ideal theist and ideal naturalist is going to be something like the kind of comparative theoretical virtue of total theory in the light of total evidence, right? And so it's who's got the better overall theory is the thing that's going to matter. But there's no prospect of making an argument in the technical sense because there isn't any prospect of even writing down the total theory or the total evidence, right? That's just not something that we can do. So it has to be that once we get to the kind of judgments about, okay, so who's overall got the best position, that we're not going to be prosecuting that discussion by argument. We're going to be, it's going to be, well, you know, I consider it all and my judgment goes this way, you consider it all, your judgment goes that way. That's sort of in the ideal. Now, of course, we're not ideal in practice. We go on kind of trading, you know, what do you say about this? What do I, you know, here's how I respond to that, and so on. But that's how you'd expect that, barring some unforeseen development that shows that there's some inconsistency in the best naturalism or the best theism, that's how the conversation's going to go on. And there's not going to be an argument that strikes a telling blow on either side. Right. So that's moved a little bit away from the Moore shift, but it's kind of in the something else to think about in this kind of general vicinity.
Yeah, so I do think going back to what you said originally in response, it's sort of going to depend on your prior commitments. I think that's interesting. I'm wondering what if you know, someone's presented with an argument, and you know they're agnostic on, let's say, one of the premises, but they do have independent reason to reject the conclusion. Like, so how does that fit in? Like, can they thereby like sort of get rid of their agnosticism and disbelieve that premise or something if they accept the other premises? Or I mean, like, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of how that fits in.
Okay, so suppose you give me an argument with a bunch of premises and a conclusion, and I accept that it's a valid argument. Right. If I don't accept one of the premises, so either because I accept the negation or because I'm undecided about it, then the argument's not making any challenge to me. I just think I don't accept that premise, right? So what's the argument to me? Right, that was a point I made much earlier on. So the question about the kind of Moore shift seems to me not even to come up, right? My first move when I'm presented with an argument on any topic is to look at the premises and see if there's any that I don't accept. If I don't accept them, then I just say, this argument doesn't make a challenge for me. And it may be true that if I'm agnostic about certain things, there's a cost that comes along with that, but maybe not, right? I mean, lots of cases, it seems to me the right thing is to be agnostic. Mm-hmm. And in effect, what you're doing is you're saying, I'm undecided between several different total theories, and that's fine. I mean, I don't think any of us should be too confident that we've got the single correct overall total theory and got it down right.
Okay. Yeah, so I do think that's interesting. I probably shouldn't have said agnostic. Maybe if someone finds it intuitively plausible, like one premise, but they have, well, I guess this is just a matter of weighing up your independent justifications, right? Because if you have much more justification for the denial of the conclusion, and you're shown that this other premise that you intuitively accept as plausible, or once you're presented with it, you find it intuitively plausible, well, then you just have to weigh up which one has more justification. Then you're just going to be like, okay, well, no, I don't accept that. Right? I mean, the model that I'm actually thinking of right now, to make it concrete, is just a sort of basic modus ponens gratuitous evil argument, right? So premise one, if there's gratuitous evil, then God doesn't exist. There's gratuitous evil, so God doesn't exist. Now, the Morean shift would be, well, hold on a second, God does exist, and hence there's no gratuitous evil. And so what I'm thinking about is that premise, the gratuitous evil. Now, most people think like, okay, well, you know, there's some intuitive plausibility to that. Like, we certainly don't see a reason for lots of evils. And so I'm wondering if the theist is just perfectly within their epistemic rights to say, like, listen, I've got all these other arguments for God's existence. And so even if I have this intuition that there's this completely pointless evil, like, I'm just going to reject that premise just because I have this independent justification. That's sort of the framework that I'm thinking of this in.
Yeah, and you might think that part of how you get to skeptical theism is just by this route, right? I can't see why this isn't gratuitous evil, but why would I be the first to know, right, what God's reasons are? It does look as though you could kind of motivate the move in the way that you're suggesting. And it's always going to be the case once new considerations are brought to, you know, once you get new information, you have to update. That's kind of the basic starting point here. And there's no rule that says you've got to hang on to everything that you've already got. Right? There couldn't be. That's an unmanageable rule. So we do go on revising our beliefs constantly in the light of new information that comes in, whether it's sense perception or it's information from people testifying. Right. And in both cases, it's complicated because it's not just data in and we process it. We assess the reliability of informants, I mean, in light of their track record and so on. So we think about things like, are they lying? Are they likely to be misinformed and so on? And similarly with perception, we do these complicated checks about, you know, are the viewing conditions really of a kind that's sort of suitable and so on. But we constantly are updating and we're constantly making these judgments of just the kind that you're mentioning, right? I mean, there's some plausibility to the idea that I'm getting this new information and I've got some prior sort of plausibility that I attach to these beliefs, but they're in tension with one another, and now I've got to do something.
And now we're back to the sort of original conception that you laid out. And so this isn't really an objection to your conception. It's sort of actually illustrating your conception of arguments, it seems.
Yeah, that's what I think. I mean, indeed, one of the things that got me started down this track was thinking about what Rowe said about the Moore shift way back in, I can't remember, it's 1979 or 1980, in that really early paper on atheism and arguments from evil.
Okay. So with respect to that, the deductive versus inductive versus Bayesian, we can sort of set that, we can cover that one at near the end-ish, if you want, because that's sort of getting beyond because we've still been focused on the sort of logical consequence deductive arguments.
Yeah.
I think we can say that one for the end if we get time for that. But we could now start getting into the sort of criticisms of your account. So we've just been, for the audience, just to recap, we've been exploring different conceptions of what makes for a good or convincing argument. And then we just talked about the Morean shift because it was a sort of related worry and whether or not it posed a problem. And it seems as though it almost vindicates it. And so now let's go into different criticisms of your account. And so one criticism is just that you said in your discussion with Feser that in a dispute, right, the arguments are, and you've been saying it in this discussion as well, that the arguments, that's not what's central. What's productive and what's central, and what will be illuminating is talking about the claims over which we disagree in the argument, right? One of the premises, for instance, that's more fundamental. one question, and I think actually Cameron Bertuzzi mentioned this in brief in his discussion, in your guys' discussion, is that one might wonder whether this is in fact more fundamental. So we can consider one such claim over which we disagree. Let's say I present an argument, we disagree with this claim, so we can zoom in on that. Won't our investigation, and this is again a hypothetical objector, I'm not necessarily endorsing this objection, but won't our investigation into our disagreement here on that particular premise, won't that take the form of investigating further arguments for that claim as our conclusion, or perhaps, and we're starting to get a regress, right? So now, if we can those arguments, then you're going to pick a claim, and then we can give arguments for that claim. So, like, where do we non-arbitrarily stop this regress?
Right. So I sort of hinted at what I'm going to say about this just a little while ago. Right. So when we discuss one claim, there'll be other claims that bear on it. Right. What we should be thinking about is total theory in the light of total evidence. And at that point, I have an argument that, I have an argument. I gave you reasons why argument is going to be irrelevant, right? Because we can't even formulate the arguments once we've ascended to that level. So it's not that I'm thinking that when we discuss a claim, we discuss it in isolation from everything else. But when we're discussing it, what we'll be interested in finding out is something like whether you've got, what are the kinds of reasons that you've got for accepting the claim? And I'm not thinking that those reasons are going to be arguments, right? Reasons will be something like that this thing is evidence for that, or that this thing can explain all these other things, or sometimes it'll be, okay, so you've got this stuff that you believe. I reckon that my theory does without that, so that it's simpler, but there's nowhere where its explanations are worse. So I've got a reason for not believing in that stuff because it wouldn't do any work for me, do any useful work for me. Things like that. And it's in saying those things, I'm not putting them forwards as arguments, right? It seems to me that they're a kind of independent activity. I'm not sure whether that Cameron's going to be entirely satisfied with that as a reply, but that's what I want to say.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you could always, like formulate those in terms of arguments, but then, I mean, you're just sort of like, that's almost like redundant, right? You could just skip and just talk about reasons, right? Like, just say it's evidence for it instead of like, if this is true, then it's, like you don't have to, it's almost as though it's redundant once you get to that ground level of, listen, I mean, we're just at these basic, this is an evidential relation, or maybe this is more intuitive, or maybe we have these global theoretical virtue considerations of which theory's simpler with maximizing the explanatory breadth and depth. So it does sound like there's a good response to that worry there.
So I think that's right. I think that the dressing things up in the formal argumentative dress will often turn out to be a waste of time. It's important if someone can't see that they're committed to absurdity or that there's some consequence of their views and they can't see it, because then there's a reason to give them a derivation. But apart from that, what you've got reason to give people is just to draw their attention to propositions they haven't thought about yet, or to raise questions about whether they're kind of adequately accommodated propositions that they have thought about. Isn't there a better explanation available to you than this one? Or wouldn't your view be simpler if you just explained that in this way and dropped your belief in those other things, and so on? But that stuff done properly has no need of appeal to arguments in the technical sense, it seems to me.
Yeah, okay, sweet. So we covered that sort of the infinite regress one, it's sort of two worries. The infinite regress one, where do we stop it? And then the related worry is just like, well, won't these further justifications just take the form of arguments? Like, so we've covered those two. I just like to recap for the audience so they see where we're going on. So we covered that objection. So another objection to your account, and this one was actually, I think it was hinted at by Feser. I'm not sure if he really sort of expounded upon it further, but when offering an argument, so this is number 13, when offering an argument, one of whose claims your detractors rejects, most philosophy papers, in their presentation of the argument, they're going to say stuff by way of defense of the premises, right? So they're gonna spell out like what you're committed to if you give up that premise. They're going to point out perhaps implausible results, or maybe absurd or just counterintuitive results.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how that could fit in, just giving that explication early on.
So it seems to me that when you're doing that, the idea of defending an argument seems to me that you're trying to justify the claim that the argument is sound. And it's hard to see that you're doing more than that. But we already rejected the arguments being sound as a reason for thinking that it's a successful argument. Right? I mean, in actual fact, I think that the primary use of arguments is you give them to someone else to show them that they're committed to things they hadn't recognized. The status of the premises is irrelevant to you. What matters is that they believe them, right? And if we're thinking about any kind of sort of transactional account of arguments, I'm giving you an argument and it's meant to make you do something. It's irrelevant what I think about the premises. And the idea that I'm going to defend the premises, whatever we imagine that activity is, it seems like it's nothing to the point when it comes to the efficacy of the argument. Now, it may seem that I've just relied on my account in responding to Feser, but that seems fine, right?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not trying to persuade him, right?
Yeah,
I'm just pointing out.
Someone else is giving you an argument why you should reject your account, and so you're actually fine if you rely on your account. You're just like, listen, I have a perfectly consistent story. You haven't given me a reason to reject it. I do. That's actually that's a foreshadowing for one of the other worries that I mentioned, but I think I'll hold off on that for just a moment, because I do have something to say in connection with this problem. It seems to me that this objection might also, and I'm just sort of thinking this on the spot, it might also collapse back into what we said earlier about the sort of basic place where you stop the regress, right? So when we're talking about giving defenses of the premises, ultimately, either those are going to be in terms of arguments or not. If it's in terms of an argument, well, then we're going to go to those claims, right? And the regress. But then we're just going to stop at that basic level, and then at some point, it's just going to be like, look, this is just evidence for this, or maybe it's simpler. Maybe my account is simpler. Maybe there are these intuitions in favor of it. We're going to get to this base level where it's no longer giving an argument for the claim, so then I just think that it almost collapses into what we already said.
Right. Okay. So that sounds okay to me. Yes.
Okay. So we covered that response. So this one is actually this one's a snarky one that I just put on there for fun. And it's sort of like just like a self-defeating one. So it's like, isn't your account self-defeating? Like, won't you have to give me arguments to accept the view that arguments are dialectically useless? I know this is easily responsible, but I know people are thinking that. Like, you're saying arguments are useless, but you have to give me arguments.
So, in fact, I kind of invited that criticism because in arguing about gods towards the end of that book, I have a discussion which is very confused. And the reason why it's confused is because I go backwards and forwards between using argument in the intuitive everyday sense and argument in the technical sense. Sure, I'm going to give you arguments in the everyday sense. I'm trying to persuade you of my position. But what I'm not doing is giving you an ordered list of premises and conclusion, right? And so it's not that in some sense I can't argue for my position. It's just that what I'm not going to do, and what I've never tried to do, is to give you an argument in the technical sense to defend my position. Right, and you have to be careful. We remember this. I mean, this is part of the reason why I wanted to start the conversation with this distinction, right? Was because eventually we were going to get to this point, right? It's very important that what we've been talking about is arguments in the technical philosophical sense, right? Nobody disputes, or at least I don't dispute, that arguing in the everyday sense is a very important activity. It's part of what makes us distinctive amongst animals, is that we argue in the kinds of ways that we do, right? What's kind of overlooked, perhaps, is that actually lots of what lots of what philosophers do is argue in the everyday sense, not in the technical sense. Right, and so that goes back to my original story and what you can learn from thinking about the case where we're arguing about whether we have to go now to catch the train or not. I think lots of philosophical argumentation is like that, and I've got no objections to philosophers arguing in that kind of way.
Okay,
so that's my answer to that one.
Yeah, that makes sense. The question does seem to be sort of resting on that equivocation between those two. So, okay, nice. So the next one is a sort of like a bootstrapping worry, right? And this is actually what I was talking about when we were talking about foreshadowing, right? When you were talking about how you were relying on your account, as it were, to give a response to it. And now someone who's observing this and they don't really have a view on the nature and purpose of arguments, they might just be like, well, hold on a second. It's almost like a bootstrapping worry, right? So in order to arbitrate among the competing conceptions of what makes for a good argument, right, wouldn't we sort of already have to have or presuppose an account of what makes a good argument? Like, if we didn't, well, then it seems as though we wouldn't be able to evaluate these competing conceptions for, you know, which ones are stronger and which ones are weaker, right? In order to evaluate your reasons and considerations for your position, I mean, it's almost as though we already have to have a criteria for successful argument. So we were foreshadowing that. And so if you could talk about that.
Yeah. So I guess here's a good point to go back to my kind of overarching idea that what we're really interested in is theories, right? And what's the method for adjudicating total theories in the light of total evidence? I have a view about this, and if you disagree with me, then I'm not sure what to do at that point, right? Because we've got to what seems to me to be kind of almost rock bottom. I'm not sure how you argue about it, and it's going to be a feature of every view that there are certain things that maybe provisionally are just fundamental. And if we've got people and we're disagreeing at that level, then there's, you know, what we need then is to find some new ground of agreement. Okay, so my thought about the deciding between theories is that basically what we're doing is trading off kind of minimizing our commitments, maximizing explanatory breadth and depth. And I'm going to apply that set of considerations to every theory, including theories about argumentation. So give me a better theory of argumentation in the philosophical sense than the one that I've got, one that commits you to less or that explains more than the one that I've got, and think about the data as everything that you know about philosophical practice and, you know, and a whole lot of other stuff like that. That's what I'm going to say, right, as my answer. And so it's not bootstrapping. I wasn't relying on the details of my account of arguments in order to get things going. I was relying on something else.
Okay, that makes sense. And that something else is sort of just like rock bottom, right? I mean, it's like, okay, if we disagree about, you know, maximizing simplicity or minimizing ontological commitment and maximizing explanatory breadth and depth, it's like, I don't know what to do anymore. It's like, we're just completely...
So that's the idea. And maybe if you think that's not quite rock bottom, we can have I can't think of where to turn to get something that's more fundamental that I get that out of, but maybe there is something, but I'm very confident that whatever it is, it's not going to be something about theory of argumentation, right? Yeah. I'm very confident about that. Argument, I mean, I know that this is just what you'd expect me to say. I just think that argumentation in the technical sense is just not that fundamental compared to other capacities that we've got and other things that we do.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So now we can move on to the re-arising worry, and this is one that Josh actually sort of expressed to me in slightly different terms. But I know you have a response to this earlier, but let me just lay it out. So don't the same dialectical problems with arguments just sort of re-arise at a higher level in applications to theory and theory choice? Now, one of your responses earlier on was no, because theories, they have these. It's almost like an infinite conjunction, right? So you can't really have an argument for an infinite conjunction. But I guess one way that I could respond to that, or Josh, or whoever could respond to that, is just by saying, okay, well, let's just like pick some fundamental core of the theory. So, for instance, for naturalism, the core, like an argument against the core of naturalism, would just be like, okay, with something with the conclusion of, it's false that there are none but natural entities with none but causal powers, or God exists, or something. Or for theism, we could pick something in the core, like I don't know, omnipotence is incoherent, or who knows, like God doesn't exist. So we don't have to talk about the infinite conjunction. We can just talk about a core. So I'm wondering if you could talk about whether or not, first of all, whether or not the dialectical problems re-arise in application to theories and theory choice, and also whether or not what I said averts your criticism of that.
Okay, so I think we're going to have to explore this a little bit further. I'm thinking that when you think about a claim like God exists, or there are none but natural entities, but with none but natural causal properties, that there's a kind of open-ended set of considerations that bear on the truth of those claims. You only have to look at the range of arguments that have been given for the existence of God to see that at least people have thought that there's an immense range of things that bear on the claim, and probably we haven't exhausted all of the propositions that bear on the claim. So it's going to be a bit tricky to suppose that we can just pull out that claim and think that there's some nice little set of things that we have to consider in order to evaluate it. That seems to me probably false. I'm not sure how fully that speaks to what you said, but I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, one of the worries that I'm thinking of in relation to this, it kind of relates to what you're saying, is like, aren't we just going back to stage one of the dialectic? Like, sure, I mean, even if the same dialectical, even if they re-arise, like, we're going to have to, even if the same dialectical problems with arguments re-arise at this higher level, we're still ultimately going to have these fundamental sort of basic methods by which we justify the different premises. So it seems as though, I don't know, it's almost as though we're getting back to stage one of the dialectic, where it's like, okay, well, what's the nature and purpose of arguments? You're giving me a set of claims. Do I disagree or agree with one of the premises? And ultimately, we're just going to get down to some sort of fundamental evidential considerations or something. And so, I don't know, it seems as though that response could almost be brought in here. I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I do want to stick by the claim that theory is more fundamental than argument.
Yeah.
Right. And that beliefs about, I don't know, let's just say attitudes towards propositions are more fundamental than attitudes towards arguments.
Yeah.
And it would take a lot, I think, to make an argument for a contrary position. It's hard to see, I mean, just thinking about it straight off, how attitudes to arguments could be more fundamental than attitudes to propositions or sentences, given that arguments just are bunches of sentences, right? It just feels like that's going in the wrong direction.
Okay, yeah. I think it started to just click now. I mean, it's just like no, I mean, even if you're giving an argument for the theory or theory choice, like, we're still going to have to bring to bear larger theoretical considerations on that argument itself, right? Because, I mean, if you're giving it to me and I already disagree with it, well, then we're just going back to, well, okay, the premise, I mean, I have a worked out theory according to which this premise is false. And so, I don't know, it's almost as though we can't sort of have these arguments re-arise at a high level in application to theory and theory choice, precisely because there being these arguments in the first place presupposes we have a pre-existing theory already in conditions for theory choice. In order to even level an argument, you already sort of have to have your theory choice and application to theories if you want to say that it's sound or whatever. So I do think it sort of brings us back to earlier stages in the dialectic.
Yeah. Okay. I'm happy with that.
Okay. So I do want to cover and if we have time after this, we could talk. We can apply what we've said here to sort of. I know I mentioned it like in passing at the top of the document that I sent you, but Feser's Aristotelian proof. If we cover this, the next thing that I want to do, because we can apply it to there, because I know a lot of my listeners are super interested in that. I know you and I have written on it and so on. So going back to that number 11, talking about the non-deductive arguments. So so far we've been focusing on deductive arguments and logical entailment, things like that. But I'm wondering about how your account of the conditions for successive arguments. I'm wondering how that relates to the sort of, well, I guess there are three types that I listed. I listed the inductive, I listed the sort of abductive, and I listed the Bayesian. And I know there are different considerations. Like some people think that one of these collapses into the others. Some people think there's disagreement here. But I'm wondering if you could talk about these different approaches, like a Bayesian or abductive, inductive, and how your conception of arguments fits into these.
Right. So I want to say a bit about Bayesian theorizing. Before, I'm not sure whether to say the other thing first or later. So I'll say it first. So there's a question about whether there's just one kind of consequence, logical consequence, or whether there's several types of consequence, right? So you might have logical consequence, you might have probabilistic consequence, you might have abductive consequence, inductive consequence, and so on. So one way that you can go is to think, no, there's just one kind of consequence, there's just logical consequence, and all arguments are properly deductive. It's just that lots of arguments are enthymemes. There are missing premises, and there are kind of standard missing premises that will turn what are commonly called abductive arguments or inductive arguments into logically valid arguments. So one person who defends that view is Alan Musgrave, but there's a bunch of other people, and it's a live position. Gil Harman, in his book Change in View, is clearly tempted by this position as well. The other way to go would be to say, well, look, what was said about logical consequence, if we think that there are other kinds of consequence, is just going to carry over. There are going to be different kinds of inconsistency, right? So there's logical inconsistency, but maybe there's also probabilistic inconsistency or explanatory inconsistency or whatever. And then all of the things that we said about logical arguments will just carry over to the other classes of arguments as well. And if you think about, forget now about whether it's logical consequence or whatever. Suppose somebody gives you an argument, and suppose that we accept that, it's one of the other kinds of arguments. There's still going to be this question that I'm going to face. How's it going to make work for me? If I already accept one of the premises, it makes no work for me. If I already accept the conclusion, it makes no work for me. If I accept the premises, don't accept the conclusion, and recognize that there's a consequence relation here, then it's going to require me to make some revision to my view, right? So although I would hardly say this was a kind of rigorous argument, it does seem to me that it's not going to be difficult to extend the account to the other kinds of argument. And that's part of the reason why I thought that it was kind of, it just makes things easier if you just think about logical consequence. On the question about whether there are other kinds of consequence, I'm undecided. I'm kind of sympathetic to the view that maybe we should just think that there's only logical consequence, but I'm definitely not committed to it, right? It's just one of the thousands and thousands of things that I haven't made my mind up about.
Okay, yeah, that does make sense. Like I really like that point about how there are going to be different kinds of sort of rational credence inconsistency. So if you accept the premises and you don't attach a correct probability to the conclusion, right? If it's a probabilistic argument or inductive argument. So I do think it's interesting that the things are going to carry over. So although there is that sort of Bayesian approach, so I'm wondering how this fits into the Bayesian approach. So like it does seem rather straightforward when we mount a Bayesian argument, right? Like you just look at, I mean, if we're doing the odds form of Bayes' theorem, right, we're just looking at the priors and we're just looking at the Bayes factor, the likelihood ratio, right? And those seem somewhat straightforward, right? And that could allow us to get to a pretty substantial conclusion about concerning probabilities of different, like pretty rigorous or pretty substantial theses in philosophy of religion, for instance. So I'm wondering if you could, because like the priors, I mean, that's just a function of the logical consistency, the simplicity of the theories, their ontological, ideological commitments. So the priors are pretty straightforward. In the likelihood ratio, I mean, you just see like whether or not you would expect it. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how, or just focus on Bayesian arguments.
Yeah. Okay, so this is probably the biggest, most complicated topic that we've got to so far. And so it's a bit hard to know where to start with this. One thing I want to say at the beginning is that we're not Bayesian updaters. That is, we're not ideal Bayesian agents. And this is quite important. So on the ideal theory, what agents do is that they update exclusively by conditionalization. Evidence comes in and they conditionalize on that evidence. And that's how they update their attitudes. Right. But none of us has probabilities for all possible propositions. For any one of us, most propositions are propositions we've never thought about and we don't have any credence attached to them. And that Bayesian machinery tells you nothing about what to do when you meet a proposition for the first time and you don't have a conditional probability of any kind associated with it. So we're not ideal Bayesian agents. Think about, though, what a community of ideal Bayesian agents would be like, right? They would, all of them, conditionalize on evidence, right? They would be logically consistent. They would be probabilistically consistent. They would never stray from either of those conditions because they're ideal Bayesian agents, right? Ideal Bayesian agents are always probabilistically consistent, and so they're logically consistent as well. They would have no use for arguments whatsoever. They would never have a reason to say to somebody else, P therefore C. At most, they would have a reason to say to somebody else, P, and then the other person would already have a conditional probability for if X says to me that P, right, and update such and such. So, so that's kind of the first point, right? That if we were a community, I think if we were a community of ideal Bayesian agents, we would have no use for arguments at all. The second thing I wanted to say is this. When we started, we assumed that we were talking about just about propositions, and we were, if we explored belief at all, we were talking about an all or nothing conception of belief. Either you believe or you disbelieve. In fact, at various points, I said things like that. The Bayesian conception is quite different, right? We have credences over propositions. Now, I think that, I mean, leaving aside the kind of point before that we're not ideal Bayesian agents, we aren't Bayesian agents at all, right? We in this sense that we don't do explicit Bayesian inference, right? I mean, here I'm thinking about inference, the kind of everyday inference, sort of, information comes in and we update on the basis of it. What's going on, the actual processing that goes on, isn't Bayesian. Bayesian methods and techniques are incredibly valuable in a whole range of cases. So I'm now moving on to another separate topic. I think that a lot of scientific, say, model selection is Bayesian. I really like the techniques that were developed by a guy at my university, Chris Wallace, sort of minimum message length inference. And that's a Bayesian theory. There's another guy in my department, Jakob Hoovy, wrote a book called The Predictive Mind and models the brain as a kind of Bayesian computational device. And that's really interesting as well. But neither of those theories comes anywhere near justifying the view that when we're consciously doing inference, moving from proposition to proposition, that there's something Bayesian about what we're doing. Okay, so what I've given you now is kind of two claims. One, that we're not Bayesian agents, and two, that ideal Bayesian agents would have no need for arguments. I'll add a third thing, which is that there isn't really, as far as I can see, such a thing as Bayesian argument. There's Bayesian inference, right? There's this idea that when you get inputs, you update in accordance with the conditional probabilities that you had for various claims, given that you get that input. But that doesn't mean that somehow or other there's a role for arguments in that processing. And I think that there isn't. I don't think that, I mean, just generally when we're processing sensory input, or when we're processing, even when we're processing what people say to us, a lot of it, there's no evaluation of a kind that would make arguments in any way relevant. Right. So what's lying at the basis of this, at least in part, is the kind of distinction that Harman. Okay, so I should confess, Harman was my advisor, and Change in View is one of my all-time favorite books, right? So he says, look, there's almost no connection between logic and inference, right? There is, I mean, he doesn't make as big a deal as I do about the Reductio and drawing out the unnoticed implications. But he says there's almost no connection, right? And while I want to kind of modulate what he says a bit, I basically agree with him, right? And so I don't think that there's this kind of thing, Bayesian argument, right? That, I mean, there's Bayesian inference, all right, but I don't think that there's Bayesian argument that's kind of distinctive and worthy of attention. So that's kind of roughly what I wanted to say about Bayesianism.
Yeah, I'm smiling because, like, in that existential inertia paper that I sent you, I like, in the Bayesian argument section, I'm thinking now that it was probably, I didn't have to do it, like, it was somewhat pointless, but I did, like, put that Bayesian argument, or I put the Bayesian considerations into argument form. I said, like, okay, well, if the probability of this given this, then it's evidence for this. And so I didn't really need to do that, right? I was just sort of summarizing it. So I'm smiling because I'm just like, well, I probably shouldn't have done that. No, it doesn't matter. What were you going to say?
No, that's fine. I mean, I'm not. I mean, it is part of my view that people often put things into argumentative form unnecessarily, but it's fine. I mean, you can do many worse things than kind of things that are slightly a waste of your effort. Right?
Yeah. So I do like that distinction between ideal and non-ideal, Bayesian individuals, right? And so if you were in the ideal, I'm summarizing for the audience, if you're in sort of ideal Bayesian world, right, there's no need for arguments, as you said. But if you're in this non-ideal world, well, then the Bayesian arguments aren't really arguments. They're sort of just non-arguments. It's a Bayesian inference. And so do you think that this Bayesian inference, like, let's say the probability, this is just an example, the probability of, I don't know, fine-tuning given theism is, I don't know, not very low, but probably fine-tuning given naturalism is very low, so it's evidence for do you think that sort of argumentation is tantamount to what we were talking about earlier, about how we're now just talking about how this is evidence for this, or this is this is intuitive acceptance, or intuitive, we're sort of at that stop point for the regress? Do you think that's what this is?
So I guess that's right. I mean, what we're doing, if we're sort of comparing big hypotheses and lots of bits of evidence, is thinking about, okay, so how much does this evidence support this hypothesis? That's the thing that we're trying to make the judgment about. or if you move to the total theory and total evidence, then somehow or other we're making a judgment about which theory does better in terms of the trade-off between minimizing its commitments, maximizing. Now, some people think, I mean, you were kind of alluding to this before, that we should model that in Bayesian terms and sort of attach numbers to it. I'm a bit skeptical about that approach. It's not that it's ruled out by what I say, because you might think that the way to implement it is to go mathematical, so that we can have prior probabilities that are actually numerical measures of how, sort of the extent to which you've minimized your commitments, and so on for the other parts of the theory. I'm skeptical about views that give you numbers, like Swinburne famously tries to do. You might say, but look, we should focus on the odds versions. But then in the odds versions, it ends up that we don't really worry about numbers. We just try to make this sort of rough assessment. Okay, so we're balancing the ratio of the priors against the ratio of the likelihoods, right? And depending on how we think that plays out, that just gives you the ratio of the posteriors. And then the way that I just said it doesn't really have numbers in it at all, right? If we're just thinking, or if we're just going to say things like, well, this is weightier than that.
Yeah, that's funny, because I prefer the odds form. I know the existential inertia paper, that I think that one was in odds form, the one that I gave. I just think it's much clearer and simpler, because oftentimes you could just bracket off the prior probability. We can say, like, okay, I mean, in this context, we could just say that they're roughly the same, or whatever, and you could just talk about a likelihood ratio. But I do think that sometimes, I don't know, numbers can, I guess, help show how radical certain evidence favors a hypothesis. So, like, in mine, the numbers that I put in there were like astounding, but I think it does help, I don't know, clarify or show the extent to which the evidence supports one hypothesis as opposed to another, if you put like some rough assessment numbers in there. I'm wondering what you think about that.
So it depends. I mean, you better be confident that it depends now what the hypotheses are, but you better be confident that all the relevant evidence is in there. If we've started from the priors prior to all evidence, and I don't know. So there are examples. Compare Newton and Einstein's theories of gravitation on the evidence. Right? How do you transform? How do you get a number for the kind of priors on Einstein's theory and Newton's theory? So I have a view about this, right? But I'm just kind of asking you this as a question, right? Because if you can't do that, then, I mean, are they roughly equal? Are they considerably different? Anyway, this question.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it depends on what prior probability is a function of, So are we talking about like coherence? First of all, it's got to be coherent. And this is how just Draper goes about it. I mean, and then he says, okay, well, then we have to look at its, commitments, ontological commitments prior to looking at the evidence. And then I don't know. I follow Draper and Jeff Lauder in that regard. Yeah. So I guess that's a rough response. I mean, also it might depend on dialectical context. So when I talked about in my paper, I was talking about comparing the existential inertia hypothesis with the sort of theistic sustenance hypothesis. And in the dialectical context at hand, I just wanted to say, like, listen, we can't just like tip the balance in favor of one or the other, like artificially from the get-go in this dialectical context. So I was that's sort of one approach that I was taking. It's like, listen, we don't want to like beg the question from the get-go, like presupposing it either way. And these are perfectly symmetrical considerations or hypotheses. And so that's really how I did it. That's how I talked about the symmetry between them. And in fact, I think the existential inertia is actually better because it's not as symmetric. Because I talked about how the theistic sustenance hypothesis builds in extra necessities. But that's how I went about it.
Yeah. Then I mean, once you start talking about symmetries and things like that, it does sound as though kind of the numerical aspect is kind of fading into the,
Yeah, it does sound.
into the background. And in the case of Newton and Einstein, you might think that since the maths for general relativity is so much harder than the maths for the Newtonian theory, that somehow the prior probability for the Newtonian theory has to be higher. But that would be a mistake, because you can rewrite the Newtonian theory in the same mathematical framework as the general theory of relativity. And then it turns out, so this was something that Michael Friedman argued in one of his books on space-time. It turns out that there's a good sense in which the Einsteinian theory is simpler than the Newtonian theory. And so it's actually got a higher prior probability if you think about it that way. But it's not obvious how to do these judgments about simplicity at all. And it wasn't that gives you, I mean, there was nothing in any of that gave numbers, right? It was just what I actually did was thought about, okay, so in the Newtonian theory, there's this kind of absolute object, extra absolute object that you're committed to that the Einsteinian theory gets rid of. You don't have sort of absolute space and time, right? And so Einstein's theory is simpler. It doesn't matter that the maths is harder. That's completely irrelevant to the, right? Anyway.
That makes sense. Yeah, the sort of, well, we can bracket off the Bayesian considerations for now, because we sort of talked about how this does relate to your account of the nature and success of arguments. Like, right, either we're ideal Bayesians or not. If we're ideal, well then arguments are still going to be pointless. If we're non-ideal, well, the Bayesian arguments, they aren't arguments, they're sort of Bayesian inferences. So I think that general dichotomy is useful here, and that's mainly what I wanted to get out of this. And so before going on to applying this to the Aristotelian proof, which we could do for the last, remaining, 20 minutes or so, do you have anything else that you want to talk about in relation to your account or what we've covered thus far?
I don't think so. The only thing I would say is that the account is kind of still evolving. I would like to make a much more detailed and comprehensive study of argument and argumentation theory, and I hope that I'll get to it, but I may not. So
next project, people, look out for a book from Dr. Graham Oppy on argumentation. Okay, so I did want to see if we could apply what we've talked about in this conversation about the nature and conditions for successive arguments to the Aristotelian proof, or I guess maybe Feser's general argumentative approach for his 5 proofs. So if you want to, I can push it over to you if you want to just lay out how Feser goes about arguing. I know a lot of our audience and me, I know we're familiar with this. If you want to talk about how he goes about it and how you in particular apply your account to his Aristotelian proof.
Okay. So, well, we'll think about the general structure. So he thinks he's got 5 independent proofs of the existence of God. Each of them has a bunch of premises. Each of them he gives an informal account of what he calls the argument, and then he has a formal argument. And in the informal account, he gives justifications for various of the premises that he accepts, where those justifications are of various different kinds. And then he has a reply to objections section in each case, where he considers what people might say against various premises that he's got and why he's not persuaded by those objections to his premises. His conclusion is that his arguments are successful. Now, given what we've said so far, if my account of arguments is right, then that just sounds like it's wrong and confused, right? Because he knows perfectly well that his opponents don't accept some of the premises in his arguments. And if he really is going to, he's not happy just to say, look, God exists, so you're wrong. Instead, he's going to say the doctrine of existential inertia, right? So you're wrong, right? It's not clear what's achieved by making that move. Towards the end of the book, what he says is something like this. I can't remember the exact words. That there are these truths that are revealed to us as kind of being the kind of necessary metaphysical truths about the world, right, or something like that. And I guess what he's suggesting is he won't take that stand on the question whether God exists, but he will take it on the stand on when it comes to the question about existential inertia. That seems very odd to me, that's how he's going to go. But this is how the way that I've been thinking about things applies in general to what Feser's doing. It's a mystery to me, right, given my views about argument, why you would bother. Okay, so over to you.
Yeah, it does. Oh man, there are just so many different places to go, because like I want to talk about existential inertia and I like want to discuss different arguments for and against it, but I also want to talk about just how your account applies to it. Let's see, where am I going to go from here? I guess I could comment on what you just said. Yeah, it does seem to me that he is trying to say like these premises are just like almost demonstrably certain or something along those lines. You know, it's like he calls his arguments demonstrations. At the end of this book, he has quod erat demonstratum or whatever, QED, which is what you put at the end of like sort of mathematical certainty he proves. In the beginning, he says he talks about the real debate and how it's between different stripes of theists. Now I know he sort of backtracked. Well, backtracked is a loaded term, but I'm gonna stick with it. Backtracked in his conversation with you what he was meaning by that. So I don't know. Just the general approach is almost, I don't know. It's frustrating to someone who's really read like the best of naturalist philosophers and like, listen, they have this worked out. It seems to be a worked out, consistent account according to which some of your premises in here are just false. And I don't know. And he's presenting these as if they're sort of demonstrably certain, or at least that's what it comes off as. And it just seems that given your account of arguments, I mean, that approach altogether is wrong-sided. But I mean, I don't even know where I'm going with this. If maybe you can comment on what I've said so far.
So, I think he does think that his premises are demonstrably certain. But what he says at the end of the book is sort of they can be, all of these claims can be rationally demonstrated. And then the question is, okay, so why didn't you do that? Why didn't you give those demonstrations? Because they're actually the ones that are of interest here. We all know that we disagree about the premises that turn up in the argument. Anybody who's read the literature in the last 30 or 40 years knows about the things that, for example, Anthony Kenny has to say against the various premises in Feser's arguments, right? So why repeat the things why give these derivations with things that you know are contested? What's the point of that? If you really think that in a certain sense they're incontestable because you've got demonstrations up your sleeve, why not give them?
Yeah.
Right? That was sort of the underlying tenor of in the end of my discussion of his argument. I end up saying something to that effect. And I think that that's fair, right? If he really thinks these things are demonstrable, he should go ahead and demonstrate them.
Yeah. So if we could just let's zoom in on the Aristotelian proof itself, at least stage one, because I know we've both been sort of focusing on that. So the key premise, or it has at least two key premises, the causal principle, well, obviously the act potency analysis of change, and that claim that any substance which is liable to change itself reduces from potency to act in respect of its existence at any moment at which it exists. So that's the one that I have the biggest, truck with, and I know you do as well, mainly because of at least according to a very systematic, worked out account of reality, existential inertia is true, according to that worked out account. And it seems as though he hasn't given sufficient reason for people who accept that account to reject that account and adopt his account. So I'm wondering if we could talk about defending the internal coherence of the existential inertia thesis. So Feser, one thing that Feser might say in response is that, listen, this is you're just refusing to give an explanation of persistence, right? We're asking for what explains why an object exists at any moment at which it exists at that moment. And if you're talking about existential inertia, you're just saying, oh well, it just does. It just persists. I'm trying to construct his. I know you know that I don't think this, but I'm just trying to construct him. So I'm wondering what you would say in response to that.
So, but there is so I mean, let's think about a thing existing at a moment. Either there are earlier moments at which it exists or there are not, right? If there are earlier moments at which it exists, then the reason why it exists now is because it existed at the earlier moments and there was nothing that caused it to cease to exist, right? And then that just is the thesis. And now it looks like that's a perfectly good explanation, right? If there's no earlier moments at which it existed, then there's going to be some story to tell about why it exists at this moment, unless this is the very first moment. And there we have a kind of interesting choice. We can either opt for brute, I say you can either go for brute contingency or brute necessity, and I kind of like brute necessity, so I'm going to think that what's there in the first moment had to be there. But that's controversial. It's especially controversial amongst naturalists, right? But it's hard to know how to prosecute that particular dispute. What are the relative costs of brute contingency and brute necessity? That's a very hard question to kind of wrap your head around, I think. But we're not thinking about that. Feser's just thinking about a case where a thing has existed for a bunch of time, and now we come to this moment at which it exists. What's the explanation for its existing at this moment of time? It just strikes me that the obvious thing to say is it existed at slightly earlier times and nothing has changed with respect to its existence. Right? That just looks like a good explanation to me. So his insisting that it's not doesn't kind of cut much ice as far as I can see.
Yeah. Okay. So I do have a lot to say on that point, but I'll try to put on my Feser hat and I'll try to respond.
Yeah.
So sure, it did exist at earlier times and nothing came along to prevent it or to cause it to cease to exist. But like still, how does it go from that time to like now? Like how are we, if there's no, I don't know, how is it even able to, go from that moment to this moment, even in the absence of something that comes along and destroys it, right? It seems as though, again, I'm putting on my Feser hat. It seems as though you're just assuming that it can persist from that moment to this moment in the absence of something coming along and destroying it. But like, how can it do that without an explanation or further explanation?
Yeah, so I'm kind of mystified by this question, as in I don't really understand it, I think. You would have to be supposing that sort of in order for a thing to, I mean, we'll pretend, because it just makes the discussion easier, pretend that the world's discrete. So we've got the immediately prior moment and then the next moment. I mean, that's not how things are, I don't think, but let's suppose that it is. That in order for a thing to exist at a particular time, what happened previously is all irrelevant, right? It's got no bearing on whether it exists now. What matters is that there's something independent that makes it exist at this moment, right? So that you've got this, at each time you've got a thing that exists at that time that's just a kind of fresh creation ex nihilo.
I know that was the point that I...
Right. Right, no, I know, because I'm borrowing from your article because I've read it, right? So sorry, I should have let you say that. But it just seems weird, right? I mean, if you don't have that picture, then what was wrong with the explanation that we were offering?
Yeah.
Right? In which case, why favor that picture, which seems weird, over the other picture, which just seems like it's everyday common sense?
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, even in demanding this sort of explanation, we are presupposing certain things about the nature of explanation and, what requires explanation, what can be metaphysically necessary, what can be brute. So when we're talking about explaining, persistence in the way that you were sort of mystified by this question, right? He's assuming that we need some sort of independent act or causal activity at each moment, independent of all prior moments. Like, that is in and of itself an assumption. And it's like, you need to give us, if you're trying to demonstrate your conclusion with certainty, you're the one who needs to be giving us reason to think that this particular moment has to have an independent cause or creator as to why it exists at this moment. Like, I have a theory according to which these past moments are either explanatorily efficacious or causally efficacious with respect to the present. But like, you're trying to offer me this new theory and trying to get me to adopt it, and it's like, you're the one who's supposed to be giving me arguments for this. Don't ask me for like an explanation. It's like, you need to show me why there needs to be an explanation in this particular way.
Right. So we could get around this by just, maybe to some extent, by just saying, okay, so here's your theory and here's the competing theory. Now let's just count up the commitments and see what we can explain. Right? It's not like I don't have an explanation of why this thing exists now. I told you what the explanation is. Right.
Yeah, and once he does that, he's sort of abandoning his project of giving, this demonstration. Now we're just doing the sort of global theoretical comparisons.
Yeah. Yes.
So I did want to say, in connection with explaining persistence, that to the audience, that roughly there are 3 ways we could go about it, or at least 3 in explaining persistence. So one of them is the one that you, Graham, alluded to, is a sort of previous moments account. So the previous moments, like, we could assume that reality is discrete, and we could say that, okay, well, what explains why a substance S exists at T? Well, it's the state and existence of S at a time immediately prior to T, in conjunction with there being no sufficiently destructive causal factors. So that's one way you could go, a sort of previous moment. And if time is continuous, you could just do some suitably small finite interval or what have you. A second way is to say that, well, when you have a substance that has no tendency, and I actually didn't include this second one, but I really wish I did, in the paper that I sent you. It's when a substance has no tendency either way, then towards existence or non-existence, or towards one condition or another condition, then no intrinsic tendency, then once it's put in a condition, and once there's nothing else, no extrinsic tendency or extrinsic factor that causes it to go in one direction or another, it would just be we could even appeal to the PSR here. It would be inexplicable if it went one condition or it went to a different condition once it's brought into the first condition. So if substances have no tendency either way, so this is actually super interesting. Feser thinks that once you demonstrate the falsity of existential inertia, you've thereby vindicated his account. Actually, if substances lack an inertial tendency, but they also lack a tendency to expire, if they lack a tendency either way, well, then it seems as though once they're brought into a condition, let's say a condition of existence or out of existence, and once there are no factors intrinsic to the thing or extrinsic to the thing that are inclining it towards one condition or another, it'll just remain in the condition that it does. Otherwise, we get an inexplicable occurrence. It's inexplicable how it goes to a different condition because there's no intrinsic or extrinsic tendency or causally inclining factor. So I think that's a really important point that Feser and other Thomists seem to miss concerning the sort of tendencies. Like, we could go with the sort of tendency account, according to which they do have this inertial tendency, but we could also say it has no tendency either way. It has no tendency towards expiration or inertia, and we can add in the PSR, which they're going to accept, and it seems as though we get a perfectly fine explanation.
It felt like that might have been an explanation of inertia, though, right?
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Right.
It would lack it wouldn't really, because Feser always talks about having a built-in tendency to persist, and it's sort of like robustness in existence. It's like, okay, well, we don't really have to speak in those terms. Let's just say it has no tendency either way. And so, but then once it's placed in a condition, that's what it stays in. Otherwise, we get. And I actually, this is a different paper, that this is precisely how we think about other domains, other conditions, right? So astronauts on the International Space Station, when they take a cup and they put it in a condition, they put it right there in like the middle of their, I don't know, space, and they move their hand, it just stays. Nothing happens. It doesn't like revert back to some state. Why is that? Well, it's because there's no intrinsic factors to the cup that pull it one way or another, and there's no extrinsic factors that pull it one way or another. So once it's brought into that condition, if it went one way or another, it'd just be inexplicable, right? So it would just stay in that condition. But then now apply this to the condition of existence. If something has no tendency either way, Well, then if it's out of existence and nothing brings it into existence, it's not going to just randomly pop into existence, because that'd be, inexplicable. And if it's in existence, if something brings it into existence, but it has no intrinsic inclining towards non-existence or towards existence, and if it has no extrinsic factors that are sort of trying to kill it, like destroy it, well, then it's just like the cup, right? It's just going to remain in existence. And that's just an explanation, right? And this is part of our normal everyday, like this is just an everyday sort of normal observance. I mean, we tend to think that, because gravity's operating on it, it requires a sustaining cause, right? I'll turn it over to you in just one second, but also, I mean, just from the nature of per se chains, of hierarchically ordered chains, in every case that Feser gives, there's some externally inclining factor that has to be counteracted, right? So the cup rests on the desk. It's precisely because gravity's pulling it down that it has to be counteracted. In space, that wouldn't be the case. You wouldn't have to have a desk that's like holding it up, because you just put it there and you let it go and it'll just stay there. And in every case of per se chains, there's always some causally inclining factor towards some different outcome. And then the sustaining cause, as it were, has to counteract that inclining factor. And that's why a sustenance is required. But when you have no tendency either way, and no extrinsic or intrinsic factors pulling either way, why on earth would we require sustaining causes? And that's adding ontological complexity, right? And so on. So I can turn it over to you. I've been speaking long. I get passionate about it, as you can see.
No, that's fine. I mean, I don't really disagree with anything that you said. And one thought was that there's something, the talking about existential inertia, I wasn't thinking of necessarily attributing some inclination to the thing. It's perfectly consistent with what I was thinking of as existential inertia, that we don't want to attribute any kinds of inclinations to the thing. It just goes on existing because nothing stops it from existing, right? I liked what you said about the chain of the cup sitting on the table, that's sitting on the floor, that's sitting on the foundations, that's sitting on the earth. The other thing to note about all of the examples is that they run out very quickly, and you can explain why they run out, right? There is nothing holding up the earth. In fact, the whole question about whether there's something holding up the earth kind of lapses once you have a kind of take a broader conception, right? And so in those cases, yes, there's a sort of sustain, in a certain sense, there's this hierarchy of dependency, but it's limited, and we know that it doesn't. We know exactly where it runs out. I mean, so to take a different example, that kind of hand moving the stick, moving the, right? I mean, abstracting or maybe assuming things that you don't want to, we might say, look, the brain is moving the hand that's moving the stick. There's nothing that's moving the brain, though, in the relevant sense. That chain just stops there. And that's very awkward for people who are looking for an argument that's going to get you to God. That every example that in the way that Aquinas does, because every example that you can think of terminates somewhere else, right? So the amount of interpretation that's required to get Aquinas' second way to look like a convincing argument is enormous, because Aquinas just starts by saying there are causes and effects, and even if he means there are per se causes and effects, when you trace them back, they don't lead to God, right? So Feser has to say, no, he had something very specific in mind. I mean, it was a great argument, Aquinas' second way. What he had in mind was this chain of existential dependence.
Existential,
right? And that's just not in the text, right? Yeah. It's not in the text. Not only it's not in the Summa Theologiae, it's nowhere in Aquinas. I mean, there are those kind of interesting arguments in De Ente Essentia, right? But it's a huge leap to think that the second way, which is after all one of the kind of standard ways that he's attributing to Greek philosophers and so on, that way is actually drawing on the arguments from De Ente Essentia. That just seems incredible as an act of interpretation to me.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I always thought that was so interesting that Feser was almost, I want to say, not like forced is a bad word, but he was forced to focus on existence, because if you don't focus on existence, you don't get the conclusion, right? For Aquinas and his different, the causal chains, the relevant causal power, right, at play is different. Sometimes it's a causal power to stay in the air. Sometimes it's a causal power to remain hot. Sometimes it's a causal power to be in motion, right? Like, you're not going to get to some unique, like, existential sustaining cause in these cases. You're just going to get to something that can make something hot without itself being made to be hot, or being able to hold something else up without being made to be held up. And there's no guarantee. In fact, we have good reason to think that these aren't going to be the same. Like, what's holding up my cup is not going to be the same as what's making the pan hot. It's just like, yeah. In order to sidestep this worry about different causal powers, because they're going to end in different entities with different causal powers and stuff, in order to sidestep that worry, you have to focus on existence. And so then you get to something that's unactualized in respect of its existence. And so I always thought that was interesting, that he had to almost restrict himself to what Thomas Aquinas does not restrict himself to. Thomas Aquinas, he talks about any causal chain. Feser has to focus in on existence because he recognizes that there's that deficiency there. Yeah.
Okay, so that's my view. At this point, we really need Feser to come and tell us why we're wrong.
Oh man, that's funny. Okay, so we talked about two accounts, one for existential inertia. One was the previous moments that explain it. Another one was simply there being no tendency either way. They're related, but they're not the same.
Yeah.
I wish I'd included that one, but we'll see. And then the third one was a sort of, well, it's a primitive feature of reality, and we're all going to have some sort of primitive persistence at the rock bottom. And primitive doesn't have to be brute contingency. It could be a brute necessity. It could just be, maybe it's not even a brute necessity. Maybe it's a necessity explained in virtue of, I don't know, the nature of just persistence. I don't know. I don't have that epistemic access a priori to like the necessary connections between the nature of persistence. And so there's that third account, the sort of primitive metaphysical necessity account, because we're all going to have a primitive at the bottom of it, right? At the bottom of explanation of persistence. And so let's cut the bud early.
Right. So I have a controversial view that all necessities are primitive. Right. I don't think we don't want to get into that now. But I do agree that ultimately, if you're going to go down the route of having necessities at all, some of them are going to be primitive. At some point, you're going to have primitive necessities. You may not want to go as far as I do and say that they're all primitive. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So those are three different accounts, just for the audience. Those are three different accounts of how we could, I guess, explain this inertial tendency. And again, you can bring in different elements of your worldview if you're like a naturalist and you have a systematic worked out account. And then you can just point to Feser, like, listen, like, you have to give me a reason to like get rid of this whole theory and adopt your theory, which you have not done in your arguments. So I I think you're right that we would need Feser on here, but my channel is too small for him to. we'll have to see if we could set something up. But if you have any last words of what I said about existential inertia.
No, I don't really have anything to add. Going back to some of the things we said before, maybe existential inertia is kind of a bad word because it suggests more than you need to be committed to, for the reason that you gave. It's the point really is just one about what you need to appeal to explain why the thing exists now. And you can do that by just saying, well, it existed earlier and nothing stopped it, right? And that's sufficient, right? That's just a sufficient explanation of why it exists now, right? And I think that your point about sufficient reason there is good, that you can appeal to something like that. And I'm quite happy with the idea that there's quite a strong version of the principle of sufficient reason that's true. And things that happen of necessity are explained by the necessity, but there's no explaining their necessity, right? That's where, according to me, that's where explanation comes to an end. And where you've got indeterminism, you've got explanation, but there are certain things that are not explained. So you don't have contrastive explanation. If you could get either A or B and you get A, then you don't have an explanation of why you got A rather than B. But you do have an explanation of why you got A, namely that it was one of the two options that could happen, and that's how the chances played out, or something like that. And that still counts as an explanation. So you can be an indeterminist and still accept a full principle of sufficient reason, right? There's nothing. There isn't anything that's true that doesn't have an explanation on that view. And yet a naturalist can say that, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I want. I know we're coming close to an end. Maybe we could wrap this up sometime soon, maybe within the next 5-10 minutes or something. But
sure.
I have heard people say that, like, oh, well, naturalism, once you establish the PSR, naturalism is done for. I'm like, no, no, it's just not true. And I don't know, maybe we could speak to that. I mean, arguably that the PSR might help us get to a necessary being or some sort of necessary thing within reality. But I mean, who's to say that that has to be supernatural, right? I mean, I know there are different arguments, stage 2 arguments from contingency, or arguments like from Feser, his stage 2. To those of you who are watching, I'm trying to write a paper on stage 2 cosmological arguments right now, so stay tuned for that. But I mean, if you could talk about naturalism and the PSR and how the people who say that the PSR is utterly incompatible with naturalism just are not correct.
Yeah, so I mean, in effect, that's what I just said, right? that and it's what, and maybe I'll tie this back to some stuff from right at the beginning. So when I wrote Arguing About Gods, there were all these arguments, and I tried to think about every objection that some kind of non-theist might make to each of the premises or to the inferential steps in the arguments. And so when I discuss arguments that have got PSR as a premise, I say, well, you might not accept the principle of sufficient reason. But it will be a mistake to think that what I was doing in that book was endorsing every one of the objections that I was making to all of the arguments. In fact, I've come around to the view that maybe there's whatever exists at the initial, at the very beginning of the universe exists of necessity. I've come around to the view that maybe I should just accept the principle of sufficient reason in a very strong form, and so on. But all of that is, as I've kind of set out elsewhere, is consistent with a very robust naturalism. So, and there's kind of more too. I think of naturalism as being characterized by a kind of causal thesis. So all causal entities, natural entities. You can combine this with realism about, for example, ethical principles, so long as you think of them as being necessary, and you accept my claim about necessary things not requiring further explanations, right? So there's nothing in this view that rules out, so it makes naturalism incompatible with realism about values of various kinds either. You may or may not like that. You might like the idea of sort of a reductive naturalism that gets rid of, ethical values and aesthetic values and so on. The point again isn't that you have to buy this, but that it's an option. Naturalists aren't faced with a kind of in-principle problem at this point. And lots of people will say that this is kind of an Achilles heel, that you can't suppose that it's wrong to torture babies for fun if you're a naturalist. But that's just false in the same way. I mean, the same kind of point that you were making.
I did have one question about that sort of, and this will be the last question, about that sort of initial singularity account. What if we found out, well, this is going to be contentious. Let's say you came to accept presentism. Then that initial singularity won't be necessarily existent, right? Because it just doesn't. It's in the past. It doesn't exist impliciter. So would you still try to affirm that there is a necessarily existent naturalistic being, but it's just the fundamental layer of physical reality? Like maybe it's a quantum field or something, or energy. Like what would you think if you came to accept presence?
So I was thinking that it's not necessarily existent in the sense, it doesn't have to be necessarily existent in the sense that it exists in every world at every time. What's true about it is that it exists in every world at the initial time.
Okay.
Right. So that's the sense in which it's necessary. So I kind of like a modal theory that says that every possible world shares some history with the actual world, diverges from it because the chances go differently. Then it falls out of that account that things that exist in the initial state are necessary, right? In the sense that I gave, not that they exist at all times, but that they exist that they couldn't have failed to exist at the first time, right? I mean, I'm not interested in providing a kind of necessary being that you might worship or something like that, right? I don't need it to go on existing. It's just it gives you a way of explaining the initial state, right? It's necessary, and then kind of in principle you can't explain what's necessary. So don't ask me for anything else. That's the end of my theory, and I've done everything I have to do.
Okay. Yeah. I think that so a quick summary. We went first over for the audience. We first went over what is an argument, and then we talked about different related questions to that, and we also talked about different conceptions of soundness plus question mark, what makes for a good argument. We talked about like the neutral agnostic view, the majority view. We also talked about Graham's conception. We also talked about the Morean shift and how that relates to all this. And then we went to different criticisms of Graham's account, and we also talked about finally different Bayesian and inductive and abductive approaches. And then finally, we talked about, we applied all this to Feser's Aristotelian proof, talking about existential inertia and so on and so forth. So that's a little summary for the audience. And so thank you all for watching this. Thank you, Graham, for joining me so much.
It was a pleasure.
Okay, so I'm Joe Schmidt, and this is The Majesty of Reason. Peace out.